Absolutely. Hello, everybody. I'm Wendy Nystrom, your host with Environmental Social Justice, and today's special guest is Sheryl Cababa. She is the Chief Strategy Officer of Optimistic Design and the author of Closing the Loop, System Thinking for Designers. So welcome to the show, Sheryl.
Thanks. Really nice to be here, Wendy.
Well, thank you for coming. And your background, you have an amazing background. So you studied journalism, political sciences, and then you kind of went into IT and tech. So what was that transition like, kind of going from one thing to another, like into systems and designing?
Yeah, it's really funny. I think when I ended up in tech and design within tech. So if you think about digital design of basically products, you can kind of think about software, etc. That's the space where I ended up. But my degrees are in journalism and political science, which I think actually helped me as a designer because, just kind of thinking about people's behaviors and people's psychology is a big part of doing good user experience design. So in the sort of like early 2000s, when I was first working at Microsoft, it really was about thinking about not just how to make software work, but honestly, how to make software easier for people to not just access, but to use and think about the patterns of use. So, for example, I don't know, just think about the interfaces that existed, let's say in like the 1980s. If you looked at a remote control in the 80s for like a VCR or something, all the buttons are the same, right? All the buttons are the same size. There's like abbreviations and things like that that don't make any sense. And then fast forward to the early 2000s, let's say when Apple came out with the iPod, and basically that sort of user experience, we call UX, is essentially based on people's behaviors and how they might be able to do many different things with something that feels simple and elegant and easy. And I think that was sort of the space in which I came up in that intersection of design and technology.
I'm personally grateful that people like you exist because I grew up when computers were brand new. And they were incredibly difficult. You had WordPerfect. My dad insisted on getting a Texas Instruments instead of an Apple. And none of us, you're just like, it was
like, oh no.
It was awful. I mean, trying to figure, and all my friends were like, oh, and when mouse first came, with Apple and their mouse, I had friends that had this, and I'm still using, trying to do WP semicolon backs. When user experience is extremely important, especially with respect to equity and making everything accessible to everyone. So that is hugely important, which is what's going to lead me to talk about what you work in now, because equity is super important. So Optimistic Design is your company, and you are working in that field of making systems equitable and research and strategy. So could you explain as simply as possible for the non-tech folks what that means?
Yeah. So when we think about design, we typically think, when people hear I'm a designer, for example, they're like, oh, you're like an interior designer or a fashion designer. And I'm like, no, I actually use design as a form of problem solving. And what that means, you've probably heard the terms design thinking, which is using the process of understanding what people do or understanding people's context, designing solutions based on the things that could be improved in their context, and then prototyping and testing those things and then kind of doing it all over again. We call that design thinking, and we also call it human-centered design. And essentially, you can think of it as just like a creative form of problem solving. And within my practice, in my design studio, we are focused on equity, which means we're not only focused on understanding how humans use technology, but or like how we can use design as a strategic way of problem solving. but we also think about who is most marginalized in the system today, and how can we better design with them in mind. Oftentimes people think about this as being referred to as inclusive design, which means like making sure that you're including those who are typically left out of design processes and designing for them, with the idea that if you design for those with kind of the most extreme experiences or who are most marginalized in the system, you're probably going to be problem solving for others too, and other people's contexts. So a good example of this is curb cuts. We oftentimes use the curb cut example as, you know, activists for people with disabilities in kind of like the 1970s argued for curb cuts so that if someone were using a wheelchair, that they can use a sidewalk continuously. Now, what's great about things like curb cuts is if you've ever been pushing a stroller or pushing a cart or pulling a wagon or walking alongside your bike, any of those instances, the curb cuts are also useful for you. And
Yeah.
so that's the notion of inclusive design, that where we're thinking about design for equity, how to use design as a tool to give people more access, more equal access to experiences. And that's, you know, kind of where a lot of our focus is at Optimistic Design.
And I mean, when you kind of lost me when you said curb cuts, I'm like, oh, that's an IT term. I don't know. No, you're actually talking about sidewalks.
The literal
the gradation dropping so you can roll something. So now I get it. So that's actually a perfect example of making it equitable, and you know, everyone benefits from that, because as a kid I rode my bike everywhere in roller skates, and yes, they came in very handy. You didn't fly off a curb or worse, trying to jump the curb, which I 9 out of 10 times missed. But when you're talking about design and equity, I mean, most people don't realize that not everybody sees the same way. Not everybody cognitively thinks the same way. Not everybody has the same capabilities to use a computer and to use a system. And you're solving all those problems and basically allowing people who might have a magnificent capacity of thought and brain power to actually interact with the world.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. So, for example, our firm does a lot of work in education, and that might be thinking about, you know, for example, there are a lot of students in the US that have English as a second language. They're multilingual learners, right? And so how do we, when we create sort of ed tech experiences, how do we ensure that we're kind of thinking about those students who represent, you know, a population that oftentimes gets ignored or left out or marginalized in the system because they don't speak English in the primary language in their school? How do we sort of ease that transition while they're learning English? How can you actually use software as a very powerful mechanism for making their experiences easier, or at least making their experiences equitable to other students? So those, you know, that's just like one example of what we might think about. We might think about like, what are multilingual students experience with this? Or even if they're not multilingual, what is the cultural experience that might help students learn better? You know, we talk a lot, for example, about cultural relevance in educational software. And I think, you know, that can expand to many other things. That could expand to how we might think about software in the context of healthcare, right? Like, healthcare settings serve lots of different people who speak lots of different languages. You have a lot of immigrants, and how can that actually help the flow of information in those settings, or help, you know, doctors or providers communicate better with their patients, or, you know, think about how you can communicate health concepts widely within communities that don't necessarily have English as a first language. Like, there's a lot of things. I live in Seattle, and there's a lot of things like when we were, you know, when the city was sort of passing on information about the COVID vaccine, for example, there are at least 8 or 9 different languages that they were kind of translating that information on and distributing it in sort of community settings where knowing about that sort of thing made a difference. And so we think about using design in this way to consider who gets typically left out of the system, and like how can we make better experiences for them, like by increasing access or by yeah, allowing them to succeed where maybe they were kind of ignored before. And that's like a huge part of like how we think about design as a very powerful tool.
And I love the fact you brought up healthcare, because there's a large percentage of people that don't go to the doctor simply because of that language barrier, or they feel that they can't talk to their doctor and so they like don't want to be bothered with it. And then a minor health condition can actually become a major health condition. And what you're doing will actually help people break down that barrier and go to the doctor and get the help that they desperately need and they deserve. I mean, it's something that should be accessible to absolutely everyone. And I love the fact that you brought in the healthcare aspect, because to me, that's hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one piece of all of this is that when you have people who are designing experiences, or you have teams or organizations that are designing experiences, sort of representation within your organization is really important in kind of understanding how to create that change. And so oftentimes we have folks on our team who come from the similar backgrounds to like the end users that we're thinking about, or we have sometimes we have a cultural moderator who kind of comes in and works with us when we're kind of doing research and kind of interacting with folks from like certain communities that we might be designing for.
Cultural sensitivity is important, because not everyone's going to know exactly how to interact, and what may work for one person may not work for another person. So that's extremely important that you pay attention to that. And I really wish more people would. Hopefully with your design, people will pay attention to that. You've had some really good success stories talking about some of the work you've done, but have you had any roadblocks, like anything that you wish that you could actually move past that maybe the viewers could help with?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it can be really hard to, especially like, we work with a lot of organizations within the technology sector. And I think oftentimes folks in the technology sector aren't really thinking about potential harm for communities that they are not necessarily thinking about. There's really broad global examples of this. So for example, when you think about products like Facebook and how, they didn't even have moderators in Myanmar, and that sort of sparked, basically kind of genocidal acts. And they didn't know how to manage that, because they didn't have anybody who could do that cultural moderation, like on their team. I think I had read at one point, this is like around 7 years ago or 8 years ago, there was only like one person who spoke the local language, like in the entirety of like Facebook's organization, or one or two people. And that's like, when you are expanding into a new marketplace, like that is like that's not really acceptable in terms of like thinking about like how you can mitigate for things that might go wrong. And so I think there's a certain level of techno optimism when we work with software developers who kind of think, well, like I'm developing solutions that are going to really help maybe all students. If you think about ed tech, they're like, this will help all students. But those whom they're kind of like working when they're doing testing or whatever, when they're kind of like coming up with understanding what the context is that they're designing for, they're oftentimes just tapping into maybe like the closest school to where their office is or something like that. And that might be like a really privileged school that is in the suburbs or something, very white dominant, very like socioeconomically privileged.
And that would be the rest of the country or their community.
Yeah. And then it's like, oh, we're designing a solution, we're testing it with students, but it's like, oh, you're testing it with like students who are not really representative of maybe even who the majority of students are in this country. Like there's a lot of schools, for example, that have really crappy internet access even. And so we found that out during the pandemic, right? That this was like an impossible thing for many schools to get over from a systemic standpoint, in terms of like, yeah, there's not only did the schools really not have like reliable internet access, but the students who went there oftentimes didn't, like, didn't have computers at home or what have you. And so I think like thinking about those things up front help you to solve for so much more and to have better impact than if you don't know about those things. And so I think that's kind of a gap, is this mentality that, this kind of like techno optimism mentality that we can see as inherent too right now when we think about like how AI is being developed. There's this idea that like we can just like put this out in the world and figure out what the use cases are. In the meantime, this can be causing harm to communities that are marginalized. I saw this thing where I think it was ChatGPT was sort of giving like health misinformation for just like for Black people, right? Like, because it's based on historical data that is already biased against Black people in the healthcare system. And it's just kind of like, yeah, we're just perpetuating like historical biases through some of this stuff if we don't kind of like have a diversity of people in the room, those who are kind of developing this software. So I think that's a big thing. That's a big barrier, I think, is just kind of like the mindset that you don't need to be thinking about other populations that are not yours or other communities that are not yours.
I would really hope that someday we will move beyond that and kind of embrace everyone's background. But I did want to highlight something you mentioned just to really hit it home for people to understand. During the pandemic, when students didn't have access to the internet, it's great that most homework assignments, if not all homework assignments, are done through the internet on a computer. You submit, it's not like the old days where you just wrote a paper and you handed it in. And when the pandemic hit, there were students that were actually going to local Taco Bells where they could get access to Wi-Fi. You couldn't go to a campus because the campuses were closed, so you couldn't even use the school's Wi-Fi. And that was actually creating a huge problem because, one, it's not exactly the safest environment for a child to go sit at a local fast food joint at night to do their homework. So we need to fix that. But we also need people like Sheryl out there helping people understand what needs to be fixed and how to do it correctly by bringing everyone to the table. And that's, I think, the most important. For me, I believe that's what is most important.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's like there's an opportunity as we're designing solutions to try to do it the right way before you have to just sort of correct for things and mitigate for things. And by kind of increasing the diversity of those who are involved in the making of a solution, I think that helps, take a lens that is important. Just like it helps you take a lens that might be different than, what you and your background, like the sort of biases like you might have as an individual or that those in your organization might have.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people that don't even realize it's unconscious bias because you just don't realize it's the way you've always done it. It's not bad. It just means you just need to pay attention, learn from people, accept other cultures, learn from other people. And most importantly, I mean, not most importantly, but I really love the fact you wrote a book. And yes, folks, I have a copy of it. I didn't get a chance to read it yet. But would you mind talking a little bit about your book and the importance of it? Because I think it's very important that when people buy the book, buy Sheryl's book, but just talk about, what prompted you to actually go from working on the systems and doing the technology and the UX and design to putting it in writing for everyone to be able to read.
Yeah, so my book is called Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. And, somebody with a design background, I was kind of seeing that a lot of the processes I'm talking about right now, for example, felt really narrow given the scope of kind of like the big problems that we're trying to solve. So systems thinking is a really good antidote to that. And when I talk about systems thinking, it's the way I describe it is almost like making visible the invisible, kind of showing how things work that are typically unseen. So a metaphor that I use to kind of explain it sort of simply is, you know, oftentimes when you're thinking about an object, and if you think about the object, it's like, this is the space that's within my concern. Um, it could be a tree, okay? And like that tree, though, is connected to other trees through its roots. They talk to each other. The trees and their canopy house different species, and there's kind of a cycle. There's like a cause and effect cycle that is around, you know, life and death. They give life to other sort of species, but then those species die and give life to the trees. These things are all interconnected, and I think about that as like, you think about systems thinking about um, considering what are, if you're just looking at a tree, there's a whole system that you're not really seeing.
Yeah.
There's interconnectedness, there's causality that's happening, and there's a wholeness to the system that might not be immediately visible. And so systems thinking is really around surfacing those things and trying to think about how, what kind of impact does this have when we're trying to make change, when we're trying to problem solve. Um, and it also recognizes the circular nature of problem solving. Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, which is a classic in systems thinking, um, he famously had this rule that said, today, I'm going to paraphrase because I never get it right, but he said, today's, today's problems are yesterday's solutions,
Oh,
because oftentimes we problem solve and that creates problems of its own. And so
I like
it's part of systems thinking is trying to anticipate what might happen and being able to mitigate or, you know, think about alternatives or accept that there's possible problems that might arise, but we should be ready to address them. And I think that's like a big part of expanding your lens, especially when you're problem solving. Um, I think of it as sort of like an anti kind of TED Talk perspective, which is like oftentimes TED Talk, there's just like this one thing that changes everything. This one device is going to allow everybody to have sustainable water or whatever all over the world. And it's like oftentimes there is not one device. Oftentimes there is a whole system of policy that needs to happen. There's a regulatory environment. There's like the entire sort of economic underpinnings. And if you're not thinking about those things, your one device probably isn't going to work or change very much. And so the systems thinking is just like a series of tools and mindsets that you might use to expand your thinking when it comes to problem solving.
I love that. I mean, I love the fact that you can use the tree as the first example because that really simplifies it so everybody can grasp that idea. But I love the fact that you're talking about how today's problems were yesterday's solutions because I actually never thought about that myself. But you are absolutely correct. We try to fix things. We try to have one solutions. We think that there's one solution to the problem when it's actually a multitude of solutions. You have to do, you know, even with today with our energy, you know, trying to resolve energy, it's not going to be one answer. We have to use multiple different things. Try to keep it clean, of course, but we have to think broadly. We have to think, and as you said, you know, anticipate mitigating a problem created from that. So, you know, you think it through. I absolutely love that idea. That is, I'm excited to read this book now. You know, I was traveling. I'm sorry about that, but
Oh no,
I
it's
really,
okay.
no, I really feel bad because I have an e-copy, folks. Wi-Fi did not work where I was. I could barely even text. So that was fun. Try turning off. You know, try not having connectivity for 2 weeks. It's mind blowing. It freaks you out a little bit. I'll be honest, but no, I just love the fact that everything is connected and you're pulling it together in a simple way because so many people try to overly complicate things, and we don't need that. We need simplification. So is your book available online or in stores yet, or is it still in process?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can find it on places like Amazon.
Oh,
It's
cool.
yeah, again, it's called Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. My publisher is Rosenfeld Media, so you can find it on their website as well. And yeah, it's readily available. I know it's called Systems Thinking for Designers, but I actually like think about it as tools for anyone who's kind of in a problem solving space that has
Yeah.
kind of multiple stakeholders and is relatively complex. There's lots of tools in there that can be useful, like just like systems mapping, which helps you gain alignment with like your different stakeholders. I oftentimes do things like there's like an iceberg diagram, which we use a lot in practice,
Oh,
which
that's cool.
kind of like helps you analyze like a problem space and identify kind of like potentially like multiple points of intervention. And so, yeah, lots of easy ways to kind of integrate more of a systems mindset into people's work, especially kind of and I think this is really important in sort of the social justice space, because we know that there's lots of implications to how you might try to change things. And, there's lots of like things that you need to about when you think about why are things the way they are. It's usually not a singular thing. And if you don't think in a systems perspective, you can oftentimes be treating the symptom rather than kind of root cause. And so, yeah, it's like I view it as like a really important lens to the work we do at Optimistic Design.
I love that. And I love the fact that, a lot of people say, oh, I'll just go in and I can fix you, or I can fix it. And it's like, think it through. And what it sounds, the book sounds like that it could be used for even someone who, I'm not a designer in any way, shape, or form, but the tools and the methodologies could be used in everyday life of kind of going through your own problem solving in your work, your life, everything. And just mapping it through in your head and thinking about all the consequences that could happen.
Yeah, actually, it was so funny. Like one of my friends, I did this workshop with her and her organization, and I had used one of these systems mapping exercises, and she was like, "I kind of want to use this with like to kind of think about my family dynamics, like to do this with like my family members to kind of understand our relationship and how people interpret things and what have you." And I was like, I never thought about that, but actually that makes so much sense, because there's oftentimes different layers of context to why we behave, even as individuals. And it could be worth just like just articulating that and, talking to like other people who are kind of in that same system about it. So yeah.
Well, book number 2, System Thinking for Families.
Oh God, I don't know if that's the space I want to get involved in.
You never know. You could actually be quite the problem solver for many, many things. You never know.
Oh my gosh. If I think about like the drama that's in my own family, I'm like, leave me out of it.
As I've learned later in life, everyone's family has drama.
Exactly.
No one is spared. So Sheryl, what is the best way for people, they want to reach out and get in touch with you, learn more about what you're doing? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think I don't check Twitter a lot anymore, unfortunately. I love an account out there, but it's not a good place to reach out to me. But I am on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to connect with folks. And so yeah, you can kind of see what I'm up to there. Also, my firm's website is optimistic.design. So
Perfect.
that's where you
Easy.
can find our work. Yeah, connect.
That's awesome. So thank you, Sheryl. Thank you so much for your time today. The work you're doing, personally, I find it extremely important and helpful to maybe solve our world's problems without creating more problems in the future. So thank you for the work that you do. And anytime you want to come back and talk more about what you're working on, I would love to have you back. I think you're fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is such a fun conversation.
Anytime. So guys, please, please, please go find Sheryl. It's SHERYL Cababa. It's CABABA. It's optimistic.design is her website. And the book is Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers. Please check it out. This is important information. It's going to help you just do things better. It's all that matters. So guys, I'm Wendy Nystrom, your host with Environmental Social Justice, and we are proudly sponsored by BioLargo. They make life better. We'll talk to you next time. Take care, guys. Bye.